Hi everybody, good evening. Before we get started this evening, I want to introduce myself to those of you that don't know me. I'm Professor Melissa Picorni. I'm also the Associate Director of the School of Art and Design. And I've been asked to start the evening off by reading our land acknowledgement statement, which is even more critically important to consider as we enter yet another season of academic celebrations and accomplishment. So, we recognize and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Piankashaw, the Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge these peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossessions that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We're also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement, and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So before we get to those introductions, our main introduction, I'm going to introduce our next person who's come up, and this is Professor Alan Meddy, who's the director of the School of Art and Design. So Alan?
Thank you, Melissa. After a 2-year delay, the School of Art and Design is thrilled that we are all able to get together to honor Bea Nettles for our 2022 Distinguished Alumni Award. And this has been a long road. We planned this in fall 20, and we've kind of like had lots of stops and starts. So we're thrilled to have everyone here to celebrate this. We wanted to share with you that in 2010, the School of Art and Design established a Distinguished Alumni Award to honor alumni for their accomplishments in their field and to their professional community. The faculty in the school nominate and select the recipients for this honor. So on behalf of the students, faculty, and staff in the School of Art and Design, we congratulate Bea for this major recognition. So I'm going to make this short and sweet, so it's my great pleasure now to ask you to please welcome Professor Lori Hogan, who is Associate Director in the School of Art and Design, who will now introduce Bea.
Good evening, everyone. I am so pleased to have this opportunity to introduce our distinguished alumna, Professor Emerita Bea Nettles. Born in Gainesville, Florida, Nettles earned her BFA at the University of Florida in 1968 and, crucially, her MFA from UIUC in 1970. She quickly embarked on her richly innovative and consequential career as an artist, but also as a teacher, beginning with Rochester Institute of Technology and the Tyler School of Art, where she taught photography as well as book arts or artist books, a practice in which she has been an innovator since the 1970s. Most importantly, she brought her pedagogy and her artistic subject matters here to the University of Illinois, where she taught in the School of Art and Design, as well as in the School of Information Science from 1984 until you retired in 2008. Known for her experimental work using alternative photographic and photomechanical printing techniques, her image books, and her one-of-a-kind artists' books, she's exhibited nationally and internationally with over 50 solo shows and countless group exhibitions in too many venues to mention. Highlights include the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, the George Eastman House in Rochester, the Light Gallery and the Whitkin Gallery in New York City, among many others. Her work is included in more than 20 permanent collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Canada, the Polaroid International Collection, San Francisco MoMA, the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., the Eastman Museum in Rochester, and the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson. Her artist books can be found in special collections and libraries at universities including Yale, Washington, and Virginia. Nettles' work investigates issues of family relationships, woven together with mythology and natural history, often in phantasmagorical, dreamlike juxtapositions. Like many feminists of her generation, she used her own body to explore the ways in which personal identities also reflected political and social realities. Art historian Jonathan Feinberg wrote that Nettles' 1970 Susanna Surprised, for example, quote, demonstrated in the uneven brown-stained surface the defiant subject matter. She stuffed this unmistakably confrontational nude self-portrait and sewed it around the edges, then fixed it onto a faint image of formal garden, end quote. The effect is one of an emotionally affecting and politically resonant statement on the female body, identity, agency, and the gaze in the history of art, as well as in everyday experiences. Of the more recent series, Return Trips, which includes new collaged and composite images, art historian Jordana Mendelsohn wrote of these juxtapositions, quote, when Nettles reuses a photograph from an earlier work and combines these new works with her mother's poetry, we are reminded of core ideas shared between generations in the Nettles family who have made the creative act an integral part of their lives, end quote. The effect here evokes a heritage of strength, support, and resistance. We were especially honored and excited to have had the exhibition Bea Nettles, Harvest of Memory, a major retrospective which opened in October 2019 at the Sheldon Art Gallery in St. Louis and traveled to the Eastman Museum in Rochester in January 2020, conclude here at the Krannert Art Museum in 2021. A book by the same name has been co-published by the Eastman Museum and the University of Texas Press. Amy Powell, curator of modern and contemporary art here at the Krannert Art Museum, has selected a concise collection of Nettles' works from among the many in Cam's collection in the museum's entryway for this event. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished alumna and treasured colleague, Bea Nettles.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm especially delighted that several former students are in the audience and also colleagues who retired as well. It's really nice that you came out for this tonight. Some time ago, we named this lecture, which was supposed to be a while back, Harvest of Memory. This is the book they were talking about, which is available from University of Texas Press. I'm going to talk tonight, because it's a very long career, more than 50 years, about three different themes that occur in my work with frequency: place, people, and time. Now, he didn't show me how to use this thing. The middle?
The button on the right.
The right. I don't know right from left, so it worked. Okay, very good. All right. As was mentioned, I grew up in Florida. I went to the University of Florida in Gainesville and got my BFA in painting. And then I took my Chevy van, which you see upstairs in the sampling, and drove up to Urbana, Illinois. And this was because I'd gotten a fellowship to come here to study painting. A lot of people, of course, assume I'm a photographer, but I was actually here for painting and did a lot of printmaking as well. And photography was an elective course for me while I was here. But I'd already started to do quite a bit of it. The Chevy van, when you go up and look at it, is printed on film, and it's a collage. And in the van, it appears that I'm bringing the palm trees from Florida home. And I'm parked on Church Street. I found my apartment pretty quickly. That's me in 1968, standing in the backyard of my apartment building, and my van there parked in the driveway. Lived on Church Street for the 2 years that I was here pursuing my degree. The portrait session that I just showed you, I ended up using again in this book, The Elsewhere Bird, in 1974. I worked with my mother in the 70s and then again in the 90s because she wrote poetry that was just parallel in a lot of ways to what I do, but just amazing poetry, which she started writing when she was 50, after she'd raised 5 kids, got them in, the last one in kindergarten. She went back and got an advanced degree, and she had a 22-year teaching career. She retired a little younger than me from teaching in a community college in Gainesville. So she was really my mentor. This is a poem that she wrote way back then, and it seems pertinent to a young person moving away from home for the first time. It's called The Elsewhere Bird. How old are we before we hear the elsewhere bird? After that day, we live in flat lands, remembering hills, or live among the hills themselves and think flat. Okay, there are several sites in Illinois that became very important to me, and I decided tonight to basically focus the work that I show you on work that was made in or around or about the years that I spent in Illinois. Starting in those early years, 1968. Someone told me about this place called Allerton Park. So I got in my van and I went out there all alone, and I couldn't believe it. There was this Victorian garden in the middle of nowhere. Plus, there were these things in the path, which I'd never seen. You don't have these down south. These were hedge apples, monkey balls, many other names for them. Osage oranges is the most polite one. So I photographed those and other aspects of the formal garden. And in those days, there was no such thing as Photoshop, and color photography was very difficult. So these were superimposed negatives done in the darkroom and hand-colored with oil paint. And they're very small images. A year or so later, still in grad school, I found out about this material called photo linen. And I did this image, which is called Pleasant Pasture. You probably recognize that out at Allerton, too. It's one of the few hills around, right? And my kids would roll down in the grass because it was just such a miracle that there was something you could do like that. This particular image was shown in 1970 in an exhibition called Photography into Sculpture at MoMA. And while I had my thesis show here in the Link Gallery, this was at MoMA, and I felt like I had it made. Going back to 1968, when I first arrived, you could also, when you're at Allerton, walk over to the corner of the walls, and there was a circular staircase, and you could walk the walls. Pretty cool. Not safe these days. No way they'd let you do it. But I discovered that on my own. I was curious, and I realized it was okay to do it. There was a staircase going up there. So I did some drawings and photographs from that perspective. And this is Private Garden, 1968. A few months later, I had done some etchings, and that's me sitting in my studio, and the etchings are on the wall behind me of that Allerton view. The first year students got the lousy studios, okay? We got the ones without the windows that were kind of crowded. The studio space for grad painters at that point is familiar to some of you as what used to be the old Idea store. It's in that strip mall right by the railroad tracks, same building. So that's where I was the first year, in sort of a windowless, very cramped space, contemplating something. Here's another image from Allerton, a collage with a lace handkerchief and an orthofilm negative image of the pathway out there. Okay, another thing that really impressed me coming here was the soil. My dad is an ag professor, was an ag professor, and in Florida, it's flat like that, so that didn't bother me. Horizons, we got plenty of those down there too, okay? But soil, nothing like that in Florida. It's mostly gray, sandy soil. So I was very impressed by it. This is a piece that the Crandard owns. I don't think it's in this particular show, but you may have seen it if you managed to see my show. It's the same etching, printed 3 times on muslin, stitched together, quilted, and put together. So it's a fairly large piece. Here's a couple of other local sites, the Virginia Theater Marquee, and also one of the only graveyard images I ever took, because I tend to think of graveyards as very cliched spots in which to photograph. But I did go over there shortly before graduation in 1970, and I shot maybe a roll and a half of film over in Mount Hope Cemetery, right across the street. And while we were sort of locked down here and the show was up at the Cranert, David Hayes and I did a walkthrough of the cemetery, and I related as much as I could about that experience. We looked at the roll of film, we tried to find the stones, and the history is very interesting. If you have time, nothing better to do, listen to it. It's still at the Cranert site, and you can only listen. There's nothing to see except I think there's a few intermittent images of the graveyard shoot. But the tablet image is one that I made from that one excursion over there. To show you the sort of film that I shot, that's a whole roll of film over there. That's a contact sheet, 12 shots to a roll. Cost money, grad student, you make the most of it. You know, you use those negatives for all they're worth, I tell you. This particular roll of film, I used pretty much every negative except the Sun Singer. I wasn't so much into the Sun Singer, but the Venus, the statue of Venus, used to be outside at Allerton. Now it's indoors. They're trying to preserve her. But I went out there to see her particularly, and also that tree. The tree was on Springfield Avenue, and I would pass it every day when I'd go home from the studio to my apartment on Church Street. I'm sure they've cut it down by now, but it became my iconic favorite tree. And I learned how to make photo screen prints around that same time. And so I made a screen print of that tree, and I used it over and over in lots of different ways. But the image above is a drawing called My Favorite Tree, Comin' and Goin'. And then the one below is a mural print that I made in the dark room here of self-portraits of me, and then the Venus statue in high contrast printed, and that's called Triple Goddess. This is one of the earlier instances of me thinking about mythology, an interest in mythology and self-portraiture. I didn't do quite so many self-portraits when I was an undergrad photo student, but I began to do them when I came here. Okay. Getting ready to end my time here at Illinois, I got a better studio, 1970, 69 and 70. The grads got their pick, the second-year grads, so I got a window. And that's me. It looks like a laundry because I've got a sewing machine in there. I've got an ironing board. Because by this point, I was doing a lot of things on fabric, much to the chagrin of several instructors. I sewed on things. Oh my goodness. I did a lot of naughty stuff back then. And you can see a few of the pieces hanging up and around. And I'm looking reasonably defiant in my studio. And then 1970, we're getting close to the time when the grad students had their group exhibition, annual group show. So we staged with my camera these portraits on the loading dock of, again, what used to be the Idea Store. We all went out there and stood around. And you're going to see several of these people as real grown-ups later. I keep in touch with some people. And I've been as far as England to see some of my friends, and you'll see them later. But this was the self-portrait, or the group portrait that we did for that show. And this was my thesis show, and it was in the Link Gallery. Hasn't changed the floor much. The lighting might be different. Hey, John. And look how modest that was. I just wrote with handwriting the title. I mean, it wasn't very presumptuous, but still, there's a lot of the work there. The swamp box is there, which you'll see if you go upstairs. It is upstairs, right? We're downstairs. Yeah, upstairs. Swamp box is there. The Cranert also owns, in the bottom lower corner, they own the Skirted Garden, that particular painting. So all of that was here. in 1970 when I graduated. And the drill then was you'd hang your show, and then for 3 hours you'd sit on a hard backless stool, and people would question you, ask questions for 3 hours solid, and that was it. And you didn't feel like going for a drink afterwards, believe me. It was tough. But this was unlike anything really that was going on here at that point in time. It was a little bit much, but you know, it worked out in the long run. Okay, so I went away for a long time. I went to Illinois. I left Illinois and I went to Rochester, where I taught at first a small college, then I went to RIT, to Philadelphia, back to Rochester, and so forth. In 1984, I came back with my husband Lionel, who's here in the audience, and our 2 young children. I was brought back in to run the photography program. At that point, they had individual programs, but they did not have an undergraduate degree in photography, and they wanted one. And it took me 2 years to get it through the State Board of Higher Education, but I finally did. And the first grad from the program, our outstanding senior sitting here, he came down from Chicago. I'll talk about that later. But he'd been sneaking into photo classes with the hope that I would get that degree passed in time for him to get a degree and be legitimate. And it worked out well. He still is a photographer, so we did something right. The image above was not the first summer. It was probably the next summer. And if you look hard, you'll see Alan Meddy there. You'll see some young people back in the background, grad students and all. We were out having a picnic. The image below is the story of how I came to live in the house that I currently live in on Carl Park. And it appeared in a book that I did called Grace's Daughter. When the realtor showed us this house and we went out into the park and we were looking back at the house, I thought, wow, that looks familiar. I really think we could live there. I really think I could live there. And then sometime later, I was looking at my proof sheets and I saw our house in Florida, like 10 years before we moved to Illinois. And I thought, how could I have photographed it when we didn't even live in Illinois? And I realized that's the childhood home of Sweetie Pie's grandmother. Like this girl I used to play with in the summer, that was her grandmother's house, and it imprinted on me. So this talks a little bit about memory, which I'm going to talk more about, but it just felt familiar enough that we bought it. All right, we're back among the hedge apples again. And also I returned to Allerton Park. This is a silly picture of me in 1984 in front of the Venus. So we know that at least Venus was still out in the woods in 1984. And I'm goofing around. And my kids are doing what kids do at Allerton Park. And then some years later, I did another image at Allerton. We're very lucky to have Allerton. It's a real sight to be seen, I think. If you've never been out there, by all means, go. Okay, Lori told you a little bit about the body of work called Return Trips. This was the last body of work that I did using film and a camera. Remember that? And it's about place. It's about a sense of place. And I'm going to show you just a few from Illinois. I don't do them anymore, but I did about 9 years worth of work with this format, which was what they call a predella. It's not a triptych, but there's a lot of little images that sort of circle one major image. And so I like the relationship of pictures, the way they work together, the way they feed on each other, the way imagery works. So you're there washing dishes, and as you dip something into the suds, it makes you think of a blizzard, and then you think of Meadowbrook Park or whatever. This is where Meadowbrook Park starts to appear in my work, in these images. The Meadowbrook Park image and the one on the right called Dock, there's a little hole in the riverbank. And this one is a kind of a bittersweet, sad image. I remember rereading The Wind in the Willows and how the I found out later it was the mole. I thought it was the river rat that couldn't find his home, but it was the mole who had a hard time finding his house. And this is more like a river rat house, but at any rate, there's a little dwelling, and I'm sort of looking to get back to my roots in this image. Here's another pair of images. And to show you how much Florida it can be like Illinois, the extreme right-hand top image is of me in undergrad school, probably 1967. That's Florida. And then a lot of the rest of it is Illinois. So they're very similar in many ways, the landscapes. Okay, so I'm going to shift now to talk about people, the role of people in my work. Place was a natural place to start, no pun intended, but I realized I just made one. Because I had just moved to a new place, Illinois, and began to kind of mourn or long for my home turf. So a lot of work dealt with that. And I think that can happen if you move. And most people do that quite a bit. Sometimes you may be moving so often that it doesn't really, nothing really registers, but certainly I'd spent so much time in Florida that it was I experienced it as a loss to leave. People. Okay, this one is called Eve Expelled. That's a self-portrait as Eve. Eve begins to appear in my work as well as Venus. Those two female nudes appear in a lot of my work. This is Eve expelled from what appears to be Allerton Park. And actually it is. It's hedge apple, bare hedge apple trees. And that could also be Eve, but it also could be me running around naked as a jaybird, as they say down south, in the middle of the winter, because I'd never seen snow till I moved here. And that was quite a shock. But this is another photo emulsion piece where I've put photo emulsion on fabric. It's a fairly large work. Here's the one that was so nicely described from Jonathan Feinberg's book. It's called Susanna Surprised, and you'll recognize that background as Allerton as well. That's the wall, one of the walls, one of the brick walls there. And I'm there, and I'm very startled to see you out there looking at me bathing. The story is that Susanna was innocently taking a bath in the garden, and these dirty old men were in the bushes staring at her, and they got her in big trouble. And she was minding her own business. But what I've done in my version is I don't show the men. A lot of paintings do, but I don't. I make it the viewer's thing to be looking at Susanna. Okay, so I'm going to bounce around just a little bit back to the 70s. I published a book called Flamingo in the Dark. They have two of these images upstairs, so I'm pleased that you'll be able to go up and see original, what were called quick prints. And I always say it's quick with a K and not with a Q, because it's not fast at all. These are light-sensitive paint that I apply to a sheet of plastic and then layer images through negatives on over and over. And if you're curious technically what it is, there's a lot of YouTube videos. There's a specific one that I do where I talk about quick print and Flamingo in the Dark in particular, that body of work. I'm showing this because this would have been my second year leaving Florida, going back to grad school. Car keys to the Chevy van in hand, and by now I have a cat. My second year, Nimbus went everywhere. He could even sleep in the van. He had his litter box in the van. We were traveling buddies. I'm leaving Florida, my sister, my dad, the palm trees behind, and that's called leaving home. By this point in time, and we're up to the 90s now, I began doing a lot more self-publishing of editioned photo books. They're not really necessarily called artist books. They're photography books that are very artistic and sequenced and thought through. But I knew enough about printing and publishing at that point to really crank it up, and I started to do a lot more publishing here in Champaign-Urbana. And Life's Lessons is a good example of that. The reason I pulled this book to show you is the picture of my kids. This is a Polaroid. It's a multiple exposure, so that you see my hands. My hands couldn't possibly be in those positions without doing a couple of exposures. And I'm holding this little picture of Rachel and Gavin, and over that had been superimposed this text from Montessori school that had some kind of fill in the blank or some kind of, what's an opposite, what's an antonym, circle the right answer. And it's, I am sad, but he is, and she circled happy. And I remember it just was so poignant to me. They don't look happy particularly, either of them, And it is something when you uproot your children and you move from one place to another. Happened to my kids, of course, a lot younger, but it's a difficult thing to do. And that was our first house. We lived on Green Street for less than a year till the traffic got to us, and then we moved. But that's the age they were when we came here. And these two portraits are pretty much my favorite portraits from that book, from Life's Lessons, A Mother's Journal. Now look at the dates on this, 87. And I'm thinking at that point already, in the first one, feminine, masculine, about duality and polarity, and either you're this or you're that. And that's what was taught in school. She was given a list of these nouns, scrambled, and asked to arrange them. So she was doing pretty good. Feminine, masculine, princess, prince, queen, king. But then she got down to these iffy words like heroine and son-in-law. It's like, what are these things? And so, it got kind of like messed up. And that's what initially struck me as wonderful. But I put her behind the screen. In the context of the book, I'm talking about how do you raise a daughter? How do you raise a son? What's the difference? What is imposed on kids from us, from without, whether we want to do it or not, from outside of the house and so forth. The other image is Gavin with the World, and that one too was such a poignant, beautiful little portrait of Gavin. And I'm guilty. I made the camouflage little sweatshirt for him. It was when I was doing a lot of sewing, because there was nothing much I could do when the kids were loose and running around. I would make clothes for them. But he's wearing his little camouflage shirt, and superimposed over him is a map of the world. And I remember making this and thinking, wow, we are laying the weight of all of this on this generation. These kids are going to have to deal with it. And this was 87, and it's even more frightening, but we're not here to be frightened tonight. But I was thinking those kinds of thoughts back then in that book called Life's Lessons, A Mother's Journal. Okay, I'm still trying to stay on topic here with portraits, but there's a lot of blurring of lines. This could also be time, but this particular one is called Faces, Phases. It's the 3 phases of the moon. And that's Rachel, myself, and my mother as the 3 phases of a woman's life. Menarche, when your period starts, Rachel was just about that age. The full moon, when you're very fertile. And menopause, when you're no longer fertile, but you're still fairly useful. There's a slice of bread there. Underneath is the yeasted dough. In the middle is a punched dough, and it looks like a belly button. I mean, that's the way my stomach still looks, but especially after having a baby, you kind of feel like that, And then the slice of the circular bread looking like a moon breaking off again. And the phases of the moon, all that was, moons have always figured in my work as well. I could do a whole lecture on moons. Anyway, these are exactly life-size portraits. That was They were mural prints that I made, again, in the old-fashioned darkroom, black and white mural paper. So they were kind of technically challenging. Okay, so now I'm shifting to time. And time is the third topic I'm going to talk about. And I think time is something that you think more and more about as you get older. I don't really think that young people particularly have as much the same concept of time or the worries about time or the thoughts about time as older people do. And so it began to enter my work more and more. It has been. In 1988, when my mother was turning 70, I think, I did a book called Corners, featuring her poetry and my imagery. And I redid it in 2008. The first one you see is offset printing with ink on paper, and the other one is print on demand, available at Lulu. That way it can always be in print. The original one eventually sold out, and I don't have very many copies of it. Okay, the book is called Corners, and it's a square book for a reason. It's the 4 ages of your life, the 4 stages of life, and so it had to be square. And that's my mother, from a very young girl to an older woman. And she wrote beautifully about the passage of time. I'm not going to have time to read you much, but there's a lot of the stuff at my website if you're curious to see more. Here's another type of time that passes. It passes pretty quickly, 28 days, once a month. Women have periods. People don't like to talk about this very much, but you know, half of us deal with it, and up to a certain point. I don't have to think about it anymore, but for a long time, I did, and it is not exactly a circle, it's more like a spiral. And you pass through 28 days and then you're somewhere else, but it's starting over again. So how do you convey an idea like that? I came up with the idea of a card deck, a deck of cards. You see day 1, you put it to the back, day 2, and you sort of shuffle through it. When you get to 28, the end of the period, I actually don't even show day 28, but it's someone going through a briar patch, kind of like, and for me it was like, oh no, here we go again. Some people it's like, whoa, yay, thank goodness. It depends on the woman. But you get back to day 1, and I've never had a show of this work. Surprise, surprise. I think they did show it in the Cranert show, but it's worth looking at and thinking about. Here's a couple more examples. I'm slipping now more into doing artist books than photos for the wall at this point. So 1995, this is a book called Turning 50. And it's a book that's divided into 3 distinct chapters. Let me think how I worked it. The present, my past, and the future. And this is the last page of the book, and you see this tree. And the tree is the same tree, but it was photographed at a place called Penland School in North Carolina over, probably there was a 30-year span at least between those 2 photographs. Penland's been a very formative place for me, and this book really attests to that, to my cycling back there again and again. The book below is actually a boxed set of books called Seasonal Turns. Again, time and the seasons appear here. When you open this box, the first image you would see would be this egg being cracked. And that was a happy accident. That's spring, as far as I'm concerned. That's when the year begins, eventually. I mean, like, this is driving me crazy, but you know, it's gonna happen, it's gotta happen. But when you open this box of books, you see this egg cracked and spring begins. What that is a floppy disk box. Do any of you remember a floppy disks? All right, so I needed that kind of box. I went out and I ordered 1,000 from China, and I got 1,000 boxes. And then they had an earthquake and I couldn't get any more. But at any rate, I made 1,000 sets of this box set of seasonal terns, the 4 seasons. And when you open the box, you crack it. It makes this cracking sound, and you actually have to kind of open it like you would an eggshell. And that's one thing I really love about the book. Yay, books, okay? My daughter's a librarian, so go, you know, the real thing, holding it in your hand, especially artist books that really do explore the tactile qualities of a book. And that's what this happened to do. And it's purely by accident. I didn't plan it that way. The cracking of the egg, the cracking of the box. This book is probably my favorite artist book. It's a very simple, it's about the size of this remote, very small little book, called The Observer, My Constant Companion. And originally it was just going to be me at 10 years old, every decade through 50. And I made a book like that. But then I was cutting the eyes out to glue on the cover of that little one-of-a-kind book, and I accidentally left the piece with the eyes cut out in a pile, and I looked over and I saw through the eyes to a different age, and I thought, wow, that's better than my idea was. This is much, much better. So I arranged it very carefully. Fortunately, there were lots of black and white frontal, pretty good pictures of me every decade. I could add a few now if I had the strength to do it. But where you see me at 10, and then as you turn through it, you see all the way straight through to the 50-year-old eyes. And when you get to 50 and you look back and there's those 10-year-old eyes looking back, it's kind of creepy. Actually, it's creepy at 10 too. But it doesn't even get equal anywhere, frankly, maybe at 20. But I find it fascinating, and I know from experience that all those people are still in me. When I get on my bike, and now my hair's long, guys, those of you that knew me, I get on my bike, and I wear a helmet, so it kind of kills the effect. But when I get on the bike and my hair's flying in the breeze, I'm 10 years old. I remember that feeling. And I actually still feel, unless I look in the mirror or I garden too long, I still feel 20, like maybe 25, 22, probably the age that I was when I was a grad student here, okay? That's how I feel inside. And I've talked to other people, and they have similar thoughts. You got to think about this too, but I've read that you feel the age that you were when you were first independent. And that was for me about 20, 21. When I moved up here, that stuck. And you have your old person in you too. I mean, technically, that person's already here in me as well. Okay, while I was teaching here, I had breast cancer, and that particular year was 2005, more or less. Can't quite remember. That's one thing I blotted out. But I was so tired. I taught through the whole experience, which kept me going. It was really important to have a goal. But the only artwork I was able to kind of keep doing was these self-portraits of the hair loss. And I set up a camera and just left it there. And once a month I would take these portraits. And so this book was also in the show. It's in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at the U of I. And the paper actually is handmade paper that has the hair that fell out embedded in the paper that my daughter Rachel made for me. And it gave her something to do. I mean, in terms of helping her mother to make the paper. And then when I was on a trip at the time when it fell out, when I got home, I had my son, Gavin, give me a buzz. So they both were able to help a little bit when their mom went bald. That's the only thing I really did. I think I did one other image of that whole experience of breast cancer. The image below is an extension of my interest in mythology and self-portraiture and so forth. This is a book called Fate Being a Necessity. And I made this while I was a resident in Iceland. I went over there for 2 months one time, and I'd go back immediately if I could, only in the summer though. And the Norse mythology has the 3 phases of a woman's life, and they're called the past, the present, and the future. And I realize I think I've got them out of order in that particular slide. The young one would probably be the first one and the old one and at the end. But at any rate, they call them Fate Being a Necessity, or the 3 Norns. And we would call them the Fates. So they're very similar mythologies in many ways with Norse and Western, supposed Western myth. Here's another structure, book structure, that can be very gimmicky. It can be tremendously fun. You've probably seen them in kids' books. They're called tunnel books, and they work like the bellows of a camera. If you pull the book out, it extends and then folds back up, and you can put it in a box. I wanted to at least try my hand at making one, and this particular one features my mother, Grace, aging gracefully. And it shows her as a little girl, and you sort of look back through to the end where you see her smiling, and she stayed cheerful through the end. She had Alzheimer's, but wasn't one of these people that goes mean on you. She was very sweet, but it was very sad as well. Oh, speaking of sad, this is 80 Little Lambs. I began, at this point, I'm all about using my cell phone camera. No darkroom anymore, no equipment, just the cell phone camera. And I'm doing a lot in graveyards, and you'll see that in a minute. But a tangential idea, or something that I see, and since it's so easy with a cell phone to do lots of things, I do collections, grids of things. And so this is the little cemetery lambs that you find all across the United States and in Europe as well, that mark the graves of babies or very young children that pass away. And so I collect them. And I arrange them in this book, and it looks sort of like a funeral pamphlet in order of disintegration. And at the end of the book, that is a cemetery lamb, that little blob there at the end of the book. And they're so worn, they can no longer be read, but the guardians still remain there. And this particular body of work I was thinking about human memory. You know, how long do people visit graveyards? How long is that going to matter? I mean, when David and I did our walk through Mount Hope, there once was a mound, an image that was on that original proof sheet that has dissolved. It is gone, and that was the founder of the graveyard. It is gone. It's a good thing I photographed it in 1969, and I wrote a little bit about it, but you won't find it there. He and I wandered around this mound of earth trying to figure out where this thing was, and I did a little research and realized, you know, few generations, it's done. So this is 80 Little Lambs, and this one is called 40 Forevers, and I photographed hearts with initials carved in trees. So this is the intro for that. Over the years, I've recorded hearts carved on trees. They raise many questions. Are pocket knives still common? I doubt it, not with airport security, but you know. Were these marks made secretly or as an open and serious declaration? My grandparents used 40 forevers to express their concept of a truly long stretch of time. Did the couples remain together forever? As can be observed in some cases, nature has the ability to erase even the most ardent emotions. And sort of towards the end of the book, you can see they were hearts, but the initials are all grown over, or some cases rubbed out or peeled off or whatever, you know. Lori and Donnie are no longer an item, you know. Okay, let's see, can I go back on this? I think I can, yeah. All right. Here, you got to look for this. I just found this today. I didn't realize it was in this book. This little grave here, That's across in Mount Hope Cemetery. That's Daisy Pickle. Daisy Pickle. And when I saw that, I had the same reaction. Oh, Daisy Pickle. And I photographed it, and I took the image, the photo home, and I spread a few other photos that I took over there out, and I realized, wow, these are nouns. They're verbs. They're adjectives. A lot of people have names like that. Nettles. Nettles can function all three ways. I got teased a lot being a bee and a nettle. Oh, my Lord. Which is probably why I find this so interesting. So I started back to Mount Hope Cemetery, and a lot was originated in that across the street with Daisy Pickle and Mount Hope Cemetery. And I photographed a lot of stones. And the first book I did was called Stone Cipher, 2011. And it was called A Book of Seasons, and it was the 4 seasons. And I stuck to 30 minutes from home, only the names of people right around here, and wrote that book. Then I branched out a bit and did the book Place. I've written Dante's Inferno and people's last names. That was the most academic and difficult. And then I've done one on Corey, Persephone, the myth of Persephone, and one called World's Mother Way. I didn't include the one on COVID. I did write the history of COVID recently too, in grave names. But I'm going to show you a little bit. This is the way Place was. Again, it's a square because it's the 4 cardinal directions in this case, north, south, east, and west. And I'm going to read you a little bit of sample so you know what I mean. This is from the south. This is a sinkhole. Okay, so these are all last names. Jaybird bickers, spring messenger pipes, bing, ping, bing, cronk, ronk, cronk. Bass bull bellows, aha, aha. Sinkhole teams, crane spears Claypool meals. Barefoot boys wade during wavering shade. Palm green shields furnish cloud cover. Hammock tester down sweet teas. Her bold cousins swim over sandrock bottoms. Rain sprinkle ferns. Sunshine stays bright during summer storm. Lavender flowers cover lake. Hawk hooks millwater snake. Ivy vines twist, twine. Blue heron waits over water's edge. Fine roots finger dark cave chambers. Now those are all last names. You can see why I'm hooked on this. And that was a long time ago. This is 2019. This is what I was able to write a few years ago. This one's called World's Mother Way. One thing that's immediately noticeable when you walk in graveyards is there's almost nothing about women. Women's jobs, women's work. I've never found, you find so-and-so's son, so-and-so, all these different jobs that men had, but very few women. Milliner I found, baker perhaps, but people are named. It's a patriarchal naming system. So how do you tell the story of women in family names when they aren't there necessarily? I found the name Mother Way, and I thought, I got to try to do something. So I thought, what could I write? And I thought, well, I've got Eve, I've got Judy, I've got Hester. I can write about these 3 women who were mothers, who also took a fair amount of grief, guilt. A lot was laid on these 3 mothers who were just trying to do their job, right? What I've also done in these 3 stories is add my twist to the way things turn out, or at least try to. So Eve, her long story, prime causer brings forth light to dark place. This is very biblical, the language. I actually had to get out my King James and go to Genesis, really try to follow it as well as I could. It's a little confusing because there's more than one version of how everything started, but at any rate, if you read it, it's very biblical. So there are a lot of people with biblical sounding last names. The one of Hester is very puritanical. It's very New England. There's cobblestones. There's the New Market Square and so forth. I tell the story of Hester and her scarlet letter. But the one that was the most fun to write was the Punch and Judy, her bitter story. husband punches Judy. I don't know how many of you know the Punch and Judy puppets, but you may have seen them possibly in a zine or something like that. There's Punch is a hand puppet. Judy's another hand puppet. And Punch obliterates everyone that comes onto the stage with him. He kills everyone. He kills his kid. He kills his wife. He kills the policeman. He kills the preacher. He kills the devil. He kills them all. And he gets away with it. At the end, he's pleased as Punch, right? Gets away with murder. So there's no real happy ending to this particular one. But it was fun to write because I could use English slang, basically. There were a lot of words that worked really well into this language. Hope's Mountain, the kids are all on the beach waiting for the Punch and Judy show to start, and young boys swarm below stage, standing on beach. Loud cheers. Hope's Mount nearing folly. Presto! Bowing, Mr. Punch enters. Noseworthy jester smiles cleverly. So you got to read it. All these are online. I didn't read the swear word part, but another time. Okay, because now this is the fun part. I thought, Harvest of Memory, why don't I show my students, pictures of my students. Also, we're talking about memory and time. Like, I get older, but they didn't. And that was always noticeable, too. But anyway, this was our first summer after we got here, probably 1985. Again, this would have been set up by George Reary, but you'll see some familiar faces, perhaps, in this image. Okay, so here we come to, we finally got the major, the Outstanding Senior Awards Ceremony, and Charlie is here in the audience, and he got it. Outstanding Senior in Photography, 1989. The next year I was contacted, of all places, by a fashion designer in New York. I don't know, that was like bizarre. But I took the job and I went over to Assisi in Italy, and I was allowed to take my own models. So two of them are in the audience, Charlie and Eric. Charlie is the star, and Eric with the beautiful heart-shaped, moon-shaped vest. Took them to Assisi, as well as Joe Vitone, who was a co-worker, co-photo teacher at the time, and picked up the guy from New York along the way. So these four men were my models for Nights of Assisi. And they got paid so well that Charlie took the money and he traveled half a year or more throughout Italy, and more than Italy, all around Europe. And he's never stopped. I'm surprised he's here tonight. Yeah, and then Eric, man, it was better than being a grad student by far, for one day of putting on these clothing. So, and my students got to sort of revel in this too, because I left class, I went to Paris to see the show, to see the fashions, and then I went again to Italy to shoot the job. So there's that book. Okay, so look hard. I don't know, we got some people here in the audience tonight, but you'll know some of these people, those of you that were here in the 90s. I taught a class called Alternative Photo Processes, which was one of my favorite classes to teach. So these were group portraits. And there I am below with Roy Jones, who was one of the grad students on the loading dock in that image. I've seen him several times over in England. Okay, I couldn't quite date this for certain, but I'm taking a wild guess. When I taught the second level photo class, I often had them do a myth, and they had to team up and work on a myth. This one is Tantalus, the myth of Tantalus. This is Medea, and these two women are here tonight as well. And I believe Margot and Soraya met doing this project in 215. That's how they met, and they're friends still, so it worked. Yeah. Okay, so a few more years. I didn't have as many. It was a little hard for me to find them, but group shots. And this was the year, actually it was 2003. I said 5, but 2003 was when I was going through chemo. And then you can see a little bit later, my hair grew back enough that I could take the headscarf off. I had a colleague here who didn't even know I was going through chemo. He thought I was going through a gypsy punk phase. No, that's what he said. I didn't know. I thought you were just going, I thought, no, not really. Not really. So from time to time, I retired in 2008 from art and design. I continued to teach a little bit for the library school after that. We get these great parties up in Chicago, but also I make an effort to find people when I go from place to place. And so in these pictures, there's former people that were grad students with me. Rocky Toner went on to be the dean of Tyler School of Art for many years in Philadelphia. And then Dan Cooney's opened a very successful gallery in New York, and that's Dan with two other of his co-grads. And I will give a shout out also to people as we go along. But Raphael came down. I appreciate him coming. Raphael was my assistant when I had the chemo, and he was a big help to me during that period. And he teaches at where? DePaul. I almost said Dexter. DePaul. Film. Another gathering in Chicago for my 65th birthday. And various parts of the world. Atlanta, the picture in Atlanta, that's Abby Drew, who was also a painting grad student. Below is dear friend Barbara DeGenevieve, who went on, she passed away, but she went on to teach at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then Jordana Mendelsohn, some of you know Jordana. I saw her in New York when she moved. And then Denise Bookwalter runs an incredible book arts program and printmaking program down in Florida State University. And the other two former students both found work in the book arts, in book either conservation or making artist books. And it still goes. When I travel, I try to find people. So Pittsburgh, New York, St. Louis, and summer school. And that's Rachel, my daughter, behind me holding the cell phone. So she grew up and got a library degree. After getting 2 art degrees, she got a library degree, but she teaches art in libraries, so it all worked out. Then I got to teach here in art and design a little bit in the fall one year when Emmy was away. Emmy, the printmaking teacher, was away at a residency, and that was tons of fun. And then, Raphael and Brent McDonald, seeing both of them in Chicago, and Eric and his wife in St. Louis. And they come to everything. They're so great. One more reunion, a couple of reunions in Chicago as well. And we got Soraya here, and Charlie. And Raphael, so pretty good turnout, very good. All right, and this is the last image, except for one conclusion. But my show opened at the Sheldon in St. Louis, and at that point we didn't know about COVID, so that all went as planned. Then it reopened in Rochester, and that went as planned for the first month, and then whammo, it's shut down, lights out the rest of the time. So they actually reopened it last April. Which is unusual, and it was shown last April from April through October for people with masks. So I got a second shot at that. At the Krannert, it was kind of on and off. It was never in person. We never had a real opening. This, tonight, was supposed to coincide with the work being upstairs, and we were going to have a big reunion. It didn't happen, as you know. But we could make trips to see it masked up. And the final image there, Brent was raised in Muhammad, and the doorbell rings one day, and it's Brent. He's in the neighborhood, and he vaguely remembers which house I live in. And he took the risk of ringing the doorbell. I'm so glad that he did. And we talked outside, that's where I meet people. And Brent works for the New York Times. He's done real well for himself as well. I found this poem, this last poem I'm going to read, that my mother wrote when she was pretty well advanced age-wise, when she could still write. And I thought it was very appropriate. I really relate to it. It's called The Secret of Success in Old Age. I wasn't familiar with it till about a week or two ago. In old age, the secret of success is to daydream up for yourself beautiful memories of things that never happened. Think of the possibilities. Oh, I love it. Okay, so that's a expansive self-portrait from me as a senior in college, getting ready to go to grad school. By that point, I had a fellowship at the U of I, and I knew I had it made. And then recently in my studio, so that's the span. I've written a lot about my work in this book called The Skirted Garden, which is also a Lulu book that I update. It's now, instead of 50 years, it's 55 years. I'd be lost without that book because I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I go back and I refer to it. But in the final conclusion to The Skirted Garden, this is something that I wrote that I think is very appropriate for tonight. Few artists work in a vacuum. I've been influenced by my life experiences. I would never claim that my professional exposure was a result of my efforts alone. A network exists, and over the years, a variety of people have lent me their support in countless ways. I see my career as a spiral, with my ideas always circling and picking up reflections of earlier thoughts. So I want to thank you for coming in, and we're not going to do questions from the audience because we have to pass things around to do that and everything. We're going to go upstairs and hang out, okay? And I'm going to put my mask back on. I'm just nervous. That's the way it is. So I may not even shake hands, but I'm here and you're here, and I'm so pleased that you came. And thank you so very much.
One more thing.
Thank you. Oh. Somebody take a picture for me, okay? I need a picture.
So we'd like to do something very official at this moment. And so the 2022 Distinguished Alumni Award, the faculty of the School of Art and Design, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, hereby honors Bea Nettles as a highly distinguished alumna and in recognition of your esteemed career as an artist whose innovative application of photography expanded our understanding of the many ways it can be used to create a work of art.
Thank you so much. You can put it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming.
So please join us upstairs in the
Yes,
gallery for
by
the
all
reception.
means. Thank you.